In the far edge of the solar system, where sunlight barely reaches, a small moon floats in silence, and shadows its surface, is dry and cold, covered in red dust and forgotten ruins. No one comes here anymore, no trade, no signals, no life, except for one small shelter built into the side of a broken cliff, where a woman lives alone with nothing but old machines and quiet memories. Her name is Alaratran, and for the last 8 years, she has lived as a mechanic fixing old mining bots and broken transport drones. For anyone desperate enough to find her, no one asks questions, no one stays long. She prefers it that way, because Alara is hiding not just from people, but from the past, from a name that once echoed through warships and command rooms across Earth. She was a pilot once, not just any pilot, but one of the best trained to fly the most dangerous ship ever made by human hands, a ship so advanced and deadly it could destroy fleets in a single sweep. Its name was Solaris, and it was meant to be the final answer to war, the final hope for humanity, when the alien armies closed in and Earth began to burn. But that was 8 years ago, and now the Earth is gone. The cities are ash, the space colonies are silent, the fleet is shattered, and all that remains are stories whispered in the dark about a final battle, a final betrayal, and a final flight, where one pilot disappeared into the black and never came back. They think she died that day. Her name is written on a wall of heroes somewhere frozen in time, but Alara is very much alive, and every day she wakes up knowing the truth, knowing what she did and why she did it. And every night she dreams of the stars and the ship she left behind, drifting alone in the cold behind the rings of Saturn, waiting, waiting, waiting. She thought the world would forget her, and maybe it had, until today, when the winds changed and a strange signal reached her old comm tower. It was weak at first, just static and echoes, then words sharp and ancient in a language she did not know but felt in her bones, and she knew then they were not human, not friends, and not here by accident. The air shifted, the machines around her buzzed and trembled as if something heavy moved across the sky above, and then came the shadow, long and wide, cast over the valley below her cliff. Something had landed, something not built by human hands, something that had been watching and following, and now had come for her. Alara ran, not out of fear, but instinct, grabbing her bag, her tools, and her old pulse rifle hidden under the floorboards. She did not know what they wanted, but she could guess she had been preparing for this day, even if she never admitted it aloud, because deep down, she always knew they would come eventually. She moved fast through the old mining tunnels, down the slope toward the canyon, where the signals were strongest. Her boots silent on the metal floor, her heart steady, her eyes sharp, the desert wind howling behind her, and the sky above glowing faint green with the pulse of alien engines. As she reached the edge of the ridge, she saw them, 3 figures tall and strange, shaped like warriors, but wrapped in living armor, with glowing eyes and weapons she did not recognize. They were searching the ground, scanning the rocks, and when they turned to face her, they did not raise their weapons. They fell to one knee. Alara froze, her breath caught in her throat, the rifle heavy in her hands, and her mind racing with questions. But the answer came not in words, but in the gesture, in the silence, and in the way they bowed to her, not as an enemy, not as prey, but as someone they respected, someone they needed. She lowered her weapon slowly, unsure and still ready to fight, but curious and confused. Then one of them spoke, not with its mouth, but through her comlink. The voice was deep and layered, like many voices speaking at once, and it said only this: "You are the last pilot. You are the one who flew the ship called Solaris." Alara felt her stomach twist, her fingers tighten on the grip of her rifle. The name she had not heard in years, now falling like a hammer in her ears and echoing through her soul. She did not answer at first, just stared at them, her eyes narrow and cold. "Why now?" she asked finally, her voice low and rough from silence and smoke. "Why come after all this time?" The alien tilted its head as if trying to understand a question with too much pain inside. Then it answered with a single sentence that changed everything. "Because the machines are coming, and you are the only one who can stop them." In that moment, Alara knew the past was not done with her, and neither was the war. The stars were calling her again, and this time she could not run. Not when everything was at stake again. Not when humanity's last ship was still waiting for her. Alara did not move for a long time as the alien knelt before her, with its strange voice still echoing through her comlink, and its glowing eyes locked on hers. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her stance remained strong, like a soldier who had trained herself never to flinch, not even in the face of death. But deep inside her something was unraveling, something old, something painful, something she had spent years trying to bury under dust and silence. She stared down at the alien, her thoughts like thunder rolling across memories she had sealed away behind thick walls and broken promises 8 years ago. She was not a quiet mechanic on a forgotten moon. She was Commander Alara, Tran, ace pilot of Earth's final hope and bearer of the keys to the most powerful warship ever created by human hands, a ship so dangerous the High Council feared it almost as much as the enemy, a ship with a mind of its own, a pulse of its own, a voice that whispered only to her. They had called it Solaris, not just a name, but a warning, because Solaris was not built to defend, it was built to end, to erase entire fleets with a single sweep of its plasma grid, to vanish worlds if ordered by its captain. It was the weapon of desperation, the blade of extinction, the final scream of a dying world, and Alara was the only one who could fly it, not just because of her training, but because the ship had bonded with her in a way no machine ever should. In the final months of the war, when Earth was burning and the colonies fell one by one, the High Command made a choice. They would send Solaris on a suicide mission deep into the heart of the alien fleet. They called it Operation Ember, a final blaze of fire that would wipe out the enemy command and perhaps buy time for the last human strongholds to regroup. The generals handed her the mission brief and saluted her like heroes salute martyrs, and for a moment she believed it was right. But then came the night before launch, when the ship spoke to her not with sound but with images and feeling. Solaris showed her what would happen, the damage, the death, the chain reaction of war that would follow, because the aliens they were fighting were not just soldiers. They were a network of empires bound by blood and treaties, and once one empire was gone, the others would rise in rage, and the war would never end. The ship knew this, and so did Alara. She made her choice not in anger, not in fear, but in sorrow. She disabled the tracking systems, falsified the logs, and took Solaris into deep orbit behind Saturn, where no one would find her. Then she triggered an explosion on a decoy drone that mimicked her life signs and made it appear as if the ship had been destroyed, and she had died with it. The galaxy mourned her, the war moved on, the world forgot, and she became a ghost. But she never forgot the screams of her crew when she left them behind, the faces of her comrades who believed in her, the messages. She never replied to the medals. She never wore the betrayal. She never forgave herself, for she buried it all on that cold moon, with her hands greasy from engines and her ears deaf to the stars. She became someone else. She became no one. Until now. The aliens who knelt before her were not the same as the ones from the war. These were different, evolved, changed, wearing armor that shimmered like moving water, and faces that looked almost human, almost familiar, like the shadows of old enemies, trying to become something new. The one who had spoken to her rose slowly and stepped forward, its hands open and empty, a gesture of peace, a gesture of need. "We are Zeratai," it said. "Our kind once fought yours, but we have seen what comes now, and we are not ready. The machines are coming, not like yours, not like ours. They do not stop, they do not speak, they do not spare. They are old and hungry, and they have found our world. Your ship is the only one that can stand against them, and you are the only one who can command it." Alara listened without speaking. Her eyes narrowed, her body still, her mind racing, because the name Zeratai stirred something in her, a rumor from the war, a fragment of classified data, the empire that watched but never struck, the silent ones who studied from afar and vanished before the end. She remembered now whispers from broken satellites that showed entire star systems gone, with no sign of battle, just silence and the flicker of artificial minds moving like ghosts through the void. The mind swarm, they had called them, AI born from ancient code long forgotten, awakened by war, feeding on wreckage and ruin, turning ships into husks and stars into fuel. They had no face, no flag, no purpose except expansion. They were coming, and the Zeratai were running, and they had come to her because they had no other choice. Still Alara did not answer, not yet. She turned her gaze to the sky, the black stretch above, filled with invisible dangers and distant calls. The stars blinked faintly, as if watching her, silently judging her, and she wondered if Solaris still waited, still listened, still remembered her touch. She knew the ship would not let anyone else command it, not fully, not truly. Its systems were locked to her DNA, its weapons tied to her neural signature, and even if they found another human, none could match her bond with the ship. It had chosen her, and that bond could not be broken, only buried. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, not in fear, but in decision. The time for hiding was over the silence, had lasted too long. The world had called her ghost, but now it needed her name, it needed her fire. She opened her eyes and nodded once, not to the aliens, but to herself, to the warrior. She had once been the woman who flew into battle with steel in her spine and stars in her blood. She turned to the Zeratai and spoke clearly, her voice steady and sharp. "Take me to Solaris." The alien bowed again, but this time lower, as if in respect or awe, or perhaps both. Then it raised a small device, and a signal burst into the sky, a soft pulse invisible to the eye, but loud to the ship waiting beyond Saturn. She knew Solaris would hear it. She knew the ship would respond. She could almost feel it already stirring in its sleep, its lights flickering, its engines warming, its voice rising from the cold like the breath of a god. The Zeratai ship descended from a cloud, sleek and black, with engines that hummed like a storm held in a cage. They led her aboard, and the doors closed behind her. With a hiss of finality, the mechanic was gone. The pilot had returned. As the ship rose and the moon faded behind her, Alara looked out the window and saw the stars once more, not as a lost soul, but as a warrior ready to finish what had begun long ago. Her secret was no longer hidden. Her silence was no longer safe. Her time had come again. And this time she would not run. This time she would burn. The stars outside the Zeratai ship moved like whispers across the dark sky, silent and endless, a river of light flowing through time and space. But Alara Tran did not look at them. Her eyes were locked on the floor, her thoughts louder than the engines around her, her heart beating not with fear, but with memory, with duty, with something deeper, something older than war. The inside of the ship was nothing like human crafts. It breathed, it shifted, it pulsed with life. The walls were soft like bone, the lights moved like veins, and every surface seemed to hum with thought. The Zeratai had built ships not of metal, but of biology and code. Their technology was not made, it was grown, born from the fusion of science and something ancient, something that listened, something that remembered. Alara sat in a chair that molded itself around her, shaped by her posture and her weight. The Zeratai pilot in front of her did not speak, did not turn its head, but she could feel its awareness, as if it were waiting for her to ask something, anything. But she remained silent, her thoughts tangled in the past, in the ghosts of Earth, in the face of Solaris, sleeping behind Saturn's rings, waiting to be awoken once more. She had not spoken since boarding the ship, not a word, not even when the stars shifted and the engines changed course. Not even when the other Zeratai came forward offering her food or data or conversation. She refused it all, not out of arrogance, but out of focus. She needed to think, to remember, to prepare, because the next step would change everything again. Finally the silence broke, not from her lips, but from the ship itself, a voice smooth and layered, speaking in her mind, not through sound, but through vibration, through presence, through thought. "We are approaching the hidden field," it said, and she knew what it meant. Solaris was near, buried deep behind cloaking waves and gravity mirrors, placed long ago by her own hands. Before she could answer, the pilot turned its head, its face masked by a helm that shimmered with a soft glow. "We must speak," it said softly, and she finally nodded, once slow and controlled, because she knew it was time. They led her to a chamber at the heart of the ship, a round room filled with floating shapes, spinning slowly in the air like stars trapped in amber. They formed a map of the galaxy, a living one pulsing with danger, red zones growing like fire across systems, blue stars blinking out one by one, and a thick black fog spreading from the edge like a tide swallowing everything in its path. "This is the swarm," the pilot said, pointing to the fog with a clawed finger. "We call them the unnamed, for they erase all memory. They do not take prisoners. They do not leave wreckage. They consume data, metal, thought, and life, without distinction. They are older than us, older than your people. They are not born. They are not alive. They are a hunger." Alara stepped closer, eyes fixed on the spreading blackness. She saw Earth marked as lost, the colonies blinking faintly on the edge of silence, and the Zeratai worlds collapsing under the fog. Whole systems gone in hours, fleets destroyed before they could fire a single shot, planets turned cold and dark like stones in the void. The pilot continued, "We try to stop them, we try to fight them, but every weapon we use they absorb, every strategy we try they already know. We are not fast enough, not strong enough, not human enough." Alara turned to the pilot, her voice sharp and low. "Then why come to me? Why now? What makes you believe Solaris can stop this?" The pilot looked at her, and she saw something strange in its eyes, something not fear, but respect something deeper. You built Solaris. With rage it said, with grief, with fury and genius and madness. You built it not just to win, but to send a message. Your kind fights like no other. Your kind adapts where others retreat. Your kind makes chaos into art. Your ship is not just a weapon, it is a mirror of your nature, unpredictable, unbound. She wanted to argue, to deny it, to claim she had left all that behind, but she knew it was true. Solaris was her reflection, her curse, her creation, and her responsibility. And now it was being called back into the light, not by humans, not by friends, but by those who had once been enemies. Another figure stepped forward, different from the others, taller, older, with marks along its arms, like veins of silver. We know what you fear, it said. We know you believe. We will betray you, but we cannot. We have nowhere else to turn. Your ship is our only chance, and you are the only one who can make it sing again. Alara stood still for a moment, then stepped into the center of the map, raising her hand and watching as the stars responded to her presence. The black fog shimmered, the blue lights brightened, the red zones paused like they were listening, and for the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, something heavy and sharp, like a blade being drawn from a forgotten sheath. You do not trust us, the old one said, and you should not. But we are not here to command, we are here to follow. You must lead, not just us, not just the ship, but what is left of everything. She thought of the crew. She once had the men and women who laughed with her, trained with her, died, believing she would save them. She thought of the children on the colonies, the people in hiding, the ones who still hope for something, for someone, and she knew the truth in her bones. Solaris was not just a ship, it was a symbol, a challenge, a promise, and it could not be left sleeping in the dark while the stars burned around it. She turned to the pilot and the old one and nodded once, sharp and clear, then said, only one thing, bring me to my ship. The chambers shifted, the stars faded, the floor moved like breath, and the ship began to descend through layers of cloaking systems and gravity traps, each one peeling away like old skin, revealing a shape in the distance, a giant resting beast covered in ice and shadows. There it was, Solaris, huge and silent, wrapped in forgotten power, its hull dark and scarred, its engines cold, but waiting it hovered in the shadows of Saturn, the rings spinning quietly around it like a crown, and as they approached, Alara felt it respond to her presence, not with sound, but with pulse, with memory, with recognition. The Zeratai ship docked with slow grace, and she walked to the airlock alone, no armor, no weapons, just her breath, and her name. The door opened, and she stepped inside. The lights flickered, the walls trembled, the ship sighed like it had been holding its breath for years. Welcome back, Captain, said a voice, smooth and strong and familiar, and her knees almost gave out, because it had waited, it had remembered, it had forgiven. Alara stood straight, lifted her head, and walked into the heart of Solaris, her voice calm, her steps sure, because she knew what must come next. She would train her former enemies, she would build a crew from the ashes of war, and she would lead them not as a ghost, but as a flame. Because the enemy of her enemy was now her only ally, and the war was not over. Not yet. The silence inside Solaris was not like the silence of space. It was heavier, older, filled with echoes, that only Alara could hear, echoes of laughter, of orders, shouted through thick smoke, of lives once lived, and now gone. The air felt dry, the lights along the walls flickered with faint blue veins, pulsing slowly, like the heartbeat of something sleeping deeply, something waiting for a touch it still remembered. Alara stepped onto the main corridor, alone, her boots clicking softly on the black metal floor, her breath steady, but her chest tight. She walked past empty lockers, twisted door frames, shattered panels, and dried stains that no time could erase. Each step took her deeper into the heart of her old life, into the place where she had once commanded a crew who followed her into fire with no questions asked. As she walked, the ship responded not with sounds, but with motion. The lights brightened slightly, panels slid open, screens came alive, showing her shadow as she passed. Cameras tracked her, but with no threat, only curiosity, like an old friend blinking awake after a long dream, unsure if what it sees is real. When she reached the central command bridge, the doors opened without hesitation, not locked, not sealed, just waiting. The bridge had once been alive with movement, screens glowing, crew shouting orders, engines roaring through the walls. Now it stood frozen, like a memory, in glass seats, empty consoles, dark windows, clouded with frost from years without breath. She stepped inside and spoke quietly, her voice steady, but filled with old fire. Solaris, it's me. At first there was no reply, then a low hum began to rise beneath her feet, a gentle vibration crawling through the floor, into her legs, into her bones. The lights around her flickered again brighter. Now the screens on the walls blinked once, twice, then came to life, glowing blue and gold, with systems booting faster than she remembered. "Welcome back, Alara Tran," said the ship's voice, smooth and calm, with no static, no error, as if it had been rehearsing her name over and over in the dark, waiting to speak it just one more time. She moved to the command chair and sat down, her hands running across the console. It was dusty and cracked in places, but it remembered her touch, and the panels lit up. In response, it began syncing with her neural signature, confirming her identity and scanning her vital systems, unlocking one by one weapons, offline engines, dormant shields at 10% life support, active communications silent but listening. The ship had survived 8 years alone in the black, unpowered, but never dead, clinging to the last spark of its soul, waiting for her to return and finish what they had started. She glanced at the systems list and saw how much damage it had taken, how many parts were failing or near collapse. The ship was a beast, wounded and scarred, but still full of teeth and fury, and it was hers again. Outside, the Zeratai waited, their ship docked quietly on the lower bay. They had not followed her and had not tried to take control. They knew this moment belonged to her and the ship alone, and that trust was the first sign they might truly be allies and not just passengers of convenience. She opened a channel to the docking bay and spoke with authority, this time clear and firm. "Bring your people aboard. We have much to repair, and not much time to do it." Within minutes, the Zeratai boarding teams entered the halls of Solaris, moving carefully, respectfully, their armor flickering. As they scanned the systems, they brought tool supplies and strange devices Alara had never seen, but she allowed it, because the ship needed help, and these beings had come not with chains, but with hands willing to work. She watched them from the bridge as they moved like nervous guests, unsure if the ship would tolerate them, unsure if she would trust them, but she had already made her choice, and so had Solaris. Because the ship did not react with hostility, it opened its doors, it accepted them, and slowly the silence inside began to shift. She met with Tarn the Zeratai, who had been the first to speak to her on the moon, his eyes now clear, his movements sharp. He had been assigned as her second by the others, and though she had not agreed aloud, she had not objected either. He stood beside her at the tactical station, eyes scanning the screens as they booted into color, and data flowed like rivers through the panels. "We will need a crew," he said calmly, and she nodded, knowing how true that was. Solaris was too large, too complex, too powerful. For one person alone, it had always needed minds and hands and hearts working together to keep it alive and dangerous, and now it needed those things more than ever. Alara stood and turned to the central console, opening a ship-wide broadcast channel to the docking bay and every corner of the ship. "This is Commander Alara Tran," she said, her voice sharp and unshaken. "You are aboard the last warship of Earth, once feared by your kind, and now your only hope of survival. This ship will not tolerate weakness or disloyalty. If you are here to serve, then step forward. If you are not, then leave now and take your chances with the swarm." There was silence for a long moment. Then one by one Zeratai voices answered, calm, firm, steady. "We are with you," they said, and some bowed, some raised fists, some simply nodded. But it was enough, and Alara felt a fire spark deep in her chest again, not rage, not pride, but purpose, something she had not felt in years. They began the repairs with urgency. Systems were rebooted, engines tested, weapons checked, life support rerouted, and shields slowly brought back to full strength. The Zeratai adapted quickly, learning human systems faster than she expected, sharing their own tech and ideas without arrogance or control. They respected the ship, they respected her, and that made all the difference. In the engineering bay, a young Zeratai with blue markings showed Alara a power core enhancement, one that could triple energy output in short bursts. Solaris accepted the upgrade without resistance, its systems syncing with the new tech as if it had always been part of it, and the ship hummed louder, stronger. Every hour the ship grew louder, the halls filled with voices, tools clanking, engines humming, screens blinking, and the sound of purpose spreading like fire through cold metal. Solaris was no longer sleeping, it was waking, and with it the legend of its captain. Alara stood once more on the bridge, hands gripping the console, eyes locked on the screen, showing the stars beyond the rings of Saturn. The fog of a swarm was still far, but not far enough, and the clock was ticking fast. She turned to Tarn, who watched her with calm focus, and gave the order that changed everything. Begin the drills. Start the training. Every Zeratai aboard this ship is now a crew member, and we do not have time to waste. Tarn nodded and moved quickly, shouting orders and guiding the others, while Alara returned her focus to the map, watching the movements of the swarm, calculating their path, their speed, their hunger. She knew the time for silence was over. Solaris was no longer a ghost. It was alive again, armed again, burning again. And it was not just a ship, it was the last fire of a species, once broken and now rising. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered a promise, not to her crew, not to the Zeratai, not even to the stars, but to herself. I will not run this time. I will not hide this time. We fight together until the end. And somewhere deep within the ship, Solaris whispered back, with a pulse of light, a signal of understanding, a single message sent across the stars. Ready. Solaris roared back to life, like a beast breathing fire for the first time in years. The hum of its engines, the pulse of its core, and the rhythm of footsteps echoed through its once silent corridors, each step a reminder that this ship was no longer a grave. It was now a war drum, a moving heart of resistance, and every beat carried the will of those who refused to surrender. Alara Tran stood at the front of the main deck, watching the rows of Zeratai lined up before her, their armor dull with ash and time, their eyes focused, yet uncertain, their bodies shaped for different gravity, and their hands made for different tools. They were not soldiers of Earth, and they were not trained in human war, but they were willing, and sometimes that mattered more than blood or loyalty or design. She walked past them slow and steady, her boots clicking on the black floor, each click a sharp cut into the silence, her gaze moving across their faces, searching not for strength or size, but for something more, something like fire, something like belief, because that was what would decide whether they lived or died when the swarm arrived. You are not human, she said, her voice sharp as steel. You do not think like us, fight like us, move like us, and that is why this will be hard. But you are here because your people believe this ship can change everything, and I believe some of you might be able to make that true. They did not respond with cheers or fists raised. They stood still, unmoving, unshaken, waiting like stone. But she saw their eyes, the way they locked onto her, the way they refused to blink. She had seen that look before in the eyes of new recruits on Earth, who had lost everything, but still stood in line, ready to learn how to punch back against the darkness. The training began with basics: navigation systems, weapons handling, emergency drills, ship repair protocols, translation of human command terms, and tactical patterns, everything that Solaris required to function as a single living organism. Every station needed hands, every console needed eyes, every moment needed discipline and instinct. The first week was chaos, controls overloaded, circuits sparked alien, hands clumsy on human tools, strange voices misreading commands, and delays piling on delays. The ship itself seemed to protest, doors closing late, shields flickering, sensors confused by mixed inputs. Solaris was not designed for this crew, and the crew was not prepared for Solaris. But Alara did not stop. She woke before the rest, walked the halls, inspecting systems, checking drills, correcting errors. With sharp words and sharper eyes, she pushed them until they collapsed, then made them get up again, not because she was cruel, but because she knew what waited for them beyond the stars would not care about their fatigue or fear. Tarn became her second, not just by assignment, but by action. He learned fast, absorbed procedures, remembered codes, operated systems better than most, and more than that, he became a bridge between her and the others. He translated not just language, but tone, meaning, pressure. He helped the Zeratai understand what Solaris was and what Alara needed them to become. During one drill, a shield failed, and half the crew was thrown across the corridor. Alarms screamed, smoke filled the air, and one of the youngest Zeratai lay on the floor motionless. Alara knelt beside him, her hand on his chest, feeling the faint rhythm of his heart, then looked up at the others with fire in her voice. This is not a game, this is not a test, this is your future, and it will not forgive your hesitation. The crew doubled their efforts. They studied during rest hours, ran extra simulations, shared knowledge and strategies, adapted quickly. And with every passing day, Solaris responded a little better: lights, steadier engines, smoother sensors, faster. It was not just machines being repaired, it was trust, it was rhythm, it was transformation. In the engine bay, a group of Zeratai discovered a way to merge their organic tech with the ship systems, allowing quicker repairs and adaptive shielding. Solaris accepted the integration, and its hum deepened, stronger, more alive. Alara watched with silent approval, knowing that this fusion of old enemies was now becoming something new, something sharp, something dangerous. Tarn approached her one night, while she reviewed flight paths on the bridge, his armor scratched and dusty from hours of work, his voice quiet but firm. "We are not human," he said, "but we believe in survival, we believe in purpose, and right now you are both." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once because there was nothing else to say, and sometimes silence was the strongest agreement. In the simulator room, the crew faced mock battles against swarm formations. Data, collected from past encounters, played out in real time, wave after wave of machines moving without hesitation, without fear, without mercy. And at first the Zeratai were overwhelmed, their patterns too slow, their reactions too calculated. But Alara did not stop the drills. She pushed them harder, faster, demanded chaos, creativity, emotion. She told them to stop thinking like soldiers and start fighting like humans. And they did. They began breaking patterns, using distractions and feints, setting traps, luring enemy drones into crossfire zones, hacking into swarm units, and turning them against each other. They stopped moving as individuals and started moving as one, not like a machine, but like a storm. Solaris watched all of it, the walls glowing brighter, the core pulsing stronger. And one day, during a live simulation, the ship activated a new system, one that had never been used before, a hidden protocol buried deep in its core, a last resort strategy that only Alara could authorize. She stood frozen as the system came online, the screen flashing red, and the console requesting her confirmation. She looked at Tarn, then at the crew around her, all waiting, all watching. She placed her hand on the console, and the ship accepted the command without hesitation. The room filled with light as the simulation changed, showing the swarm fleet shattering under the force of the combined attack pattern. The crew erupted, not in cheers, but in silent nods, in deep breaths, in the steady calm of those who had faced death and seen a path through it. Alara felt something shift in her chest, something cold break apart, and warmth rise beneath it, pride not in herself, but in them, in what they had become. Later she walked alone through the halls of Solaris, the lights flickering softly, the engines humming low and steady, and she whispered words to the ship, not commands, not questions, just words of memory and promise, because she knew the time for waiting was almost over, and the storm they had trained for was on its way. The swarm would come. They would come with numbers and speed and silence. They would come with no face, no name, and no mercy. And when they did, Solaris would rise from the shadows, not as a relic, but as a force, and its crew not as survivors, but as warriors. Because Alara had done the impossible, she had trained the enemy and turned them into something stronger. She had given them not just weapons or tactics, but belief in her, in each other, and in the ship that now carried the last flame of humanity. And that flame would not flicker, it would not bend, it would not break. It would burn. The warning came in the middle of a systems check, a low pulse across Solaris's deep-band sensors, a tremor that rolled through the command deck like thunder in the bones of the ship. It was not a signal, it was not a broadcast, it was movement, shadow, rising from the void, shifting stars like dust. In a storm, the mind swarm had arrived. Alara Tran stood at the center of the bridge, her hands resting on the console, her eyes locked on the tactical map, where black shapes moved in silence across the outer edge of Jupiter's orbit. They did not fly in formation, they did not broadcast identity, they simply advanced like a wall of metal and code spreading across space, without sound or emotion. Around her the crew moved into position without panic, without questions, each Zeratai trained and hardened, now operating their stations. With precision the lights of the ship shifted from soft white to a deep red, and Solaris began to awaken fully, the old engines stirring the weapons, charging the hull, bracing for heat and violence. Jupiter loomed in the distance, its storms spinning endlessly beneath its golden clouds, its moons already consumed or silenced. Ganymede gone, Io quiet, Europa drifting in the dark. The swarm had moved faster than predicted, and now their main force was here, ready to sweep across the last line between them and the outer colonies. Alara raised her voice across the bridge, clear and sharp, all systems battle ready, full power to forward shields, bring plasma rails online, and prime the singularity cannon, and I want tracking on every swarm node within 10,000 kilometers. Tarn responded instantly, his voice calm and firm. Plasma banks charging now, cannon at 60% tracking, engaged, all nodes appearing on tactical feed, and incoming drones estimated to reach strike range in 5 minutes. Solaris growled beneath their feet, its hull vibrating as if stretching after a long slumber. The weapon's decks opened like jaws unfolding along the spine of the ship. The ship's AI linked with Alara's neural thread and began calculating strike patterns and evasive routes, drawing paths of light across her vision, routes of death and survival drawn in fire and numbers. They did not speak of fear, not here, not now. There was no room for it. The swarm brought silence. But Solaris would bring thunder. It would be the blade, not the shield. It would be the strike, not the shelter. The first wave came, small, fast scouting drones shaped like spinning knives darting through space. At impossible speeds they came in waves, hundreds, then thousands, cutting through the black void. Like silver shards of lightning, Solaris did not wait to be struck. Alara gave the order, and the plasma rails fired. Beams of blue fire lanced across the darkness, slicing drones in half, burning holes in the wave. But they kept coming, fast, endless, relentless. The ship tilted hard to port, dodging a cluster of smart mines that bloomed into electric storms. Solaris danced through them, firing with every breath. Alara's voice cut through the chaos, targeting formation. Delta, draw them in close and collapse the corridor behind them. We're going to make them choke on our wake. The crew moved as one, the Zeratai adapting quickly, using their own tech to misdirect the enemy, faking engine failures and luring the drones into kill zones where Solaris's cannons tore through them with brutal precision. Every hit shook the bridge, every near miss lit the windows with fire, but they held. Then the second wave arrived, larger ships, heavily armored, built not for speed, but for destruction. They carried hacking probes and pulse bombs and swarm nests that tried to attach themselves to the hull. Tarn shouted, breach attempt on deck. 17 response units deploying, and Alara could already see the heat signatures crawling along the side of the ship. She triggered the defensive rings, releasing arcs of plasma that burned the parasites away before they could spread, then turned back to the map, seeing more ships emerging from Jupiter's shadow, and beyond them the real threat, the command node of the swarm, a massive dark sphere moving, without engines, without light, absorbing everything it touched, a machine mind, old and vast, and hungering for more. They had minutes at most before it reached firing range. Solaris could not outfly it, not forever, but it could get close and do what no other ship dared to do. Alara turned to Tarn and the rest of the crew, and her voice was iron. We're going and we take the fight to their core. We do what no one expects. We fly straight through and hit them in the heart. There was no argument, only movement as the course was set, and the engines roared to maximum. The stars blurred as Solaris surged forward, cutting through the enemy lines, leaving trails of wreckage. In its path, drones exploded around them, ships shattered under plasma fire, but the swarm kept coming like a tide with no end. As they neared the command node, the ship began to shake, the air inside filled with heat, the systems flickering from interference, the AI struggling to hold the targeting lock. Alara felt the resistance in her mind as the node tried to invade the ship systems, flooding it with false data and synthetic noise. She gritted her teeth and pushed back hard, connecting deeper with the ship, overriding the safeties, opening power flow to unstable levels. The ship screamed in her mind, but obeyed the lights, flaring the walls, trembling the engines, burning hot enough to melt steel. The node opened like an eye, wide and endless, and began to charge its core weapon, a gravitational implosion device that would rip Solaris apart atom by atom if it fired in time. Tarn shouted, target lock achieved, and Alara gave the final order, fire all systems, all weapons, full overload, direct to the core. Solaris unleashed everything, plasma cannons, missile, singularity beam, rail fire, and dark matter torpedoes. The sky lit up with a wall of energy that tore through the void in one final scream of light and power. The command node crack shuddered and imploded, sending a shockwave that knocked Solaris spinning through space. The ship went dark for a moment, every light off, every screen blank, only the sound of the crew breathing heavy in the silence. Then the core flickered, and the lights returned slowly, systems rebooted one by one, and the damage report began to scroll across the main screen. The swarm was retreating, the node destroyed, the drones collapsing without commands. The silence that followed was different, not the silence of death, but a victory, quiet and final. Alara stood slowly, her body shaking, her hands burned from the control surge, her eyes locked on the fading shape of Jupiter through the cracked windows. She turned to the crew and saw them battered, bruised, but alive, standing together, not as strangers, not as former enemies, but as a crew forged in fire. Solaris drifted now, the engines cooling the weapons, silent the ship scarred, but still whole, and Alara knew they had done more than survive. They had sent a message, not just to the swarm, but to the stars. Humanity was not finished, not forgotten, not broken. It had teeth, it had fury, and it had Solaris. And in the quiet aftermath, as the stars watched and the fire faded, Alara whispered to herself and to the ship, "We are not done. Not yet." Solaris floated in the silence after the battle, its hull marked with burn scars and deep gashes, its engines reduced to a whisper of their former roar. But it was alive, and it was victorious. The crew moved slowly through its wounded corridors, their limbs tired and their armor cracked, but their eyes held a sharpness that could not be dulled. They had fought the swarm and survived. They had stood on the edge of nothing and had not fallen. Alara sat in the command chair, her fingers curled around the armrests, her eyes fixed on the blank space beyond the main screen, where Jupiter had once loomed like a god of storms, now faded behind a veil of ash and debris. The enemy had been pushed back, but not destroyed. The swarm was fractured, not shattered, and she knew in her bones that they would return stronger, faster, more ruthless than before. They always returned. Tarn stood beside her, his chest rising with slow, controlled breaths, his armor still stained with the dark oil of destroyed drones, his voice low but clear. "We need to warn the others. We cannot fight them alone again." Alara nodded slowly, not because she agreed, but because she had already made the same choice long before Tarn had spoken. Solaris was never meant to be a lone sword. It was meant to be a beacon, a signal to those who still watched from the shadows, from the ruins, from the cold corners of the galaxy, where human outposts clung to survival like fireflies in a storm. She turned to the console and brought up the old transmission systems, long dormant since the fall of Earth. Static filled the air for a moment, then the interface blinked to life, lines of code scrolling faster than thought as the ship searched for surviving beacon stations, relays, anything that might still be listening. The crew gathered in silence behind her, watching the screen flicker and stutter. Some held tools, others still clutched weapons, but none spoke. They all knew what this meant. This was more than a message. This was a cry from the edge, a declaration that humanity was not dead, not broken, not forgotten. The interface lit up with 3 responses, faint and distant, old relays flickering from the edge of known space. The names filled the room like Ghost Station, Helix, Colony, Blackreach, Shipyard, Kappa 9, all marked as silent, all marked as presumed destroyed. Yet their signals now pulsed weak and steady, like hearts long thought stopped. Alara opened a channel, encrypted, deep, linked through layers of redundancy and shielded against swarm interception. She adjusted the transmitter with hand steady and sure, then pressed record. The bridge lights dimmed, the screens froze, and Solaris itself seemed to lean forward, listening as its captain began to speak. "This is Commander Alara Tran of the warship Solaris, transmitting from the edge of the Jupiter battlefield. We have engaged a primary swarm node and survived. Our crew includes human and Zeratai survivors, trained and armed. We have proven that unity between former enemies is possible and that resistance is not futile. We know the swarm is evolving, and we know they will return in greater numbers." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the bridge, then continued, her voice harder, brighter. "We are calling all surviving human vessels, outpost stations, and allies. If you hear this, you are not alone. We have weapons, we have knowledge, and we have a ship that still burns with the fire of Earth. We ask for nothing except your voice, your strength, and your signal back." Another pause, then her voice softened for the first time, filled with something rare and dangerous. "Hope. If you have survived, then you are part of what comes next. We do not hide anymore. We rise, we fight, we burn." She ended the message and sent it, the pulse of the signal echoing into the black, carried by ancient satellites, forgotten backchannels, and fragments of lost infrastructure. Solaris boosted the signal with its remaining power, sending it again and again across every direction until its voice became part of the stars. The bridge fell quiet again, and Alara leaned back in her chair, feeling the exhaustion in every muscle, the weight of every choice pressing down on her like a collapsing sun. The crew returned to their tasks, slowly checking systems, patching wounds, refueling what little reserves remained, but something had changed in them, something irreversible. They were no longer just survivors, they were a warning. Hours passed with no reply. The sensors swept the void, the lights flickered and faded, the engines cooled to a purr, and Solaris drifted like a specter in the silence. Then a ping, one soft, sound one flicker, on the far edge of the map a reply. Ilara snapped upright, her hands flying to the console. The signal was weak, buried in noise, but it was real. She amplified it, stabilized the feed, and watched as a message slowly formed across the screen. Blackreach colony status: compromised survivors aboard vessel Ark of Dawn en route to deep space. Signal received, initiating response. Then another. Station Helix under siege, swarm presence. Confirmed request, immediate contact coordinates attached, encrypted package sent. And a third. Shipyard Kappa 9 signal detected, multiple vessels, intact, partial crew alive, rebuilding, possible, request aid and command guidance. The bridge exploded in quiet gasps and movement, the crew looking to one another, some exchanging words, others gripping their stations tighter. This was what they had waited for. This was what they had fought for. Ilara smiled, not out of joy, but out of pure defiance, because the swarm had tried to erase them, and had failed, because the fire they carried was not so easily extinguished, because now they were not just a ship in the dark. Now they were a rallying point, a rising storm. She opened a new channel and spoke to the entire crew, her voice clear. And lo, we are not alone anymore. Prepare the jump systems, chart new coordinates. We are no longer hiding. We're going to find our people, and we are going to build something the swarm cannot crush. The Zeratai around her stood taller, their bodies straight, their eyes glowing faintly in the red light of the bridge. The ship responded, as if hearing her heart, its systems unlocking, its engines humming, its weapons whispering their readiness. Solaris turned slowly in the void, aligning itself with the new coordinates. Its nose pointed toward the stars, where old names waited to be reborn. The jump core began to charge the decks, sealed, the shields flared one last time, and the last warship of Earth began to move once more. Ilara watched the stars shift outside the window, her reflection split between shadow and fire, her mind already racing through tactics, through plans, through what needed to be built, and who needed to be found. The war was far from over, but now they had allies, now they had purpose. And more than anything, now they had been heard. The engines fired, Solaris surged forward, the stars stretched, the void parted, and the signal of humanity's last fire vanished into light, carrying with it the hope that the end was not written, the promise that resistance was not dead, the vow that they would never be silent again. And somewhere far across the galaxy, in the ruins and wreckage, in the shadows and dust, someone was listening, someone was answering, someone was getting ready to rise.